Great. Good afternoon and welcome to the November meeting of the Massachusetts Board of Early Education and Care. I'm Noni Lasso, Chair of the Board, and wonderful to have you here joining us. As we noted in our messages last week and in my memo to all of you, the plan for the meeting this afternoon is a departure from our regular set of agenda items to go a little deeper on our workforce discussions. Which have, of course, been ongoing since the strategic plan process and through the pandemic, but most recently at our August retreat and our September meeting also, when we heard from the commissioner on the plans for the credential work that's underway, and we'll pick up on that again today. So we're going to start with routine business and then move to a status update on the ARPA grants, just as we've received that kind of update in prior months, and then a brief update on the credential work. And from there, we'll take a short break to transition to the roundtable. I'll say a little more then about its design and context, but it involves some speakers who are connected to workforce innovations and solutions from a number of lenses and with ties to several sectors, which is exciting and I think gives us sort of a different way of picking up this conversation and motivating some of the potential work of the board in partnership with the agency, but also just a chance to kind of broaden our lens at a really important and historic moment for early ed, both federally, but also in the Commonwealth. So with that, I will say, I'm excited about this meeting. Also want to just note that, of course, things continue to progress. Grateful to the commissioner and her team for continuing to steer through this transition period, hopefully continuing out of the pandemic, particularly as we have the good news of children being now eligible for vaccine age 5 to 11. So I'm going to turn it over now to the secretary and then the commissioner, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just to pick up on that last point, the Pfizer vaccine has now been approved for children ages 5 to 11, in addition to 12 and up, obviously. There are over 500 locations, including doctor's offices and pharmacies, where the vaccine is available. The state has also set up a mobile vaccination program for any school, community, or organization that wants it. And so interested individuals should go to vaxfinder.mass.gov to find a location near them where they may be able to access the vaccine for their children. But also, if organizations or community groups want to request a mobile vaccine, they can go to mass.gov/mobile vaccine form. That's all one sort of long run-on word to request mobile vaccination service. Again, it's pretty straightforward, pretty easy to do. So the vaccine is obviously, children are now eligible for it, and it's widely available. And we obviously want to encourage everyone to get as many people, their children and their communities vaccinated as possible. Sort of shifting gears maybe to budgetary matters. Of course, negotiations continue in Washington, which may have important implications for childcare throughout the country, childcare funding in particular throughout the country, including Massachusetts, of course. But I hesitate to predict that outcome, either in terms of timing or what the final bill might look like. But closer to home, there is an ARPA bill that was passed by the House and is now pending in the Senate, and that's somewhere between $3.6 and $3.8 billion based on federal funding that's already been allocated to Massachusetts. That's focused on things like workforce development, housing, the environment, health and human services, higher education, and building renovations focused on things like ventilation. There are some initiatives that might connect to early education, but frankly, that's not a major focus of the package. So we'll continue to monitor that, obviously, and report back to you all in a timely way to keep you apprised of what's happening on that front and what is ultimately in the package that may have a direct or indirect impact on the early education system. With that, let me turn it back over to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Thanks, Secretary. Commissioner.
Yes, so I just wanted to pick up on a couple of threads. You'll hear a lot more today around our updates on our initiatives to support educators. I wanted to pick up on a couple key components that the secretary was saying, as we certainly try to keep an ear to the ground in Washington as well and understand what the impacts of the evolving federal bills might mean for Massachusetts, both on the funding level, but also on the specifics of the content of the bills. I wanted to hit on just, I think, the way that it seems to be structured in Washington at a very high level that we think is a part of the frame of where we are trying to make sure that we're tracking to some of the ability, should that funding come through, that we're tracking to the ability to implement quickly and support the field effectively. It does seem that the two packages are considered a birth to 5 childcare package and a universal pre-K package, which functionally would make our existing childcare more of an after-school support and for out-of-school time services. And so that is one of the things that we are watching closely to understand what would that evolution look like for our current funding and the requirements for our current funding, and how we are in a great place in Massachusetts to really effectively think about implementing a mixed delivery model for that universal preschool programming and really think constructively around the birth to 5 childcare requirements that they're putting in place. So particularly, I think as we look at communities right now, actively looking to work across schools and community organizations and thinking about preschool expansion, we're learning a lot that will put Massachusetts in a really good place to effectively support all parts of the field and all sectors should the package come to completion and at some point. The other thing I wanted to highlight is as we march towards implementing the new parent fee model that you all authorized, that also does continue to hit on the parent affordability construct that the federal government is looking to build into the package as well. And our parent fee structures would not only meet their guidelines, but also really, I think, be ahead of the curve nationally, should that, again, that federal funding come with some of those affordability requirements. You'll hear a lot more today around how we are looking at our as Chair Lasso said, around our operational grants, and I'll give some updates on that, as well as some of the educator work. And so I won't go into depth on that, but I wanted to at least let everyone know how and where we were seeing the federal package align with some of the work that we've been trying to push and innovate on at the state level. I'll hand it back over to you.
Great, thank you. Appreciate also the moving target in DC and also trying to decode exactly what's there and what's part of the narrative, but what's actually in the in those documents. So we'll keep in touch, and thank you for staying on top of that, because once it happens, it does look like a short timeline, 36 months at best, it looks like for now anyway. So we'll see. Okay, let's just take a moment and move to our routine business, which is just the approval of the minutes from the October board meeting. So I have that set. Let me just find it. That is minutes of October 12th, 21, I think, if I have the date right. Let me open this file. Sorry, I have too many files open. Great. Any edits, comments, amendments to the October minutes?
I just wanted to note that I wasn't there. I was listed.
Oh, right. Okay, great. We'll make that change. Anything else? Great. So let me make the motion. Apologies, it was the 14th. Let me make the motion that we approve the minutes of the October 14th board meeting with one amendment, that Nikki Ruiz de la Rizigaga was absent. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Carolyn. I'm just going to go through on my screen. Paul Belcito.
Yes.
Sheila Balboni.
Yes.
Carolyn Kane.
Yes.
Nikki Ruiz. Oh, I'm sorry. Nikki was absent. Secretary Pizer.
Yes.
Jamila Lee.
Yes.
Maura Siegel.
Yes.
That's everybody. Thank you. Approved. All right. So now we will turn to 2 departmental updates, and then we'll take a short break and transition to the roundtable discussion. So I'm going to turn it back over to the commissioner.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Charlie. So, and I wanted to talk, I think today we're hoping that we can spend a little bit of time letting you know the updates in the ARPA grants. Obviously, this is one of the most innovative approaches that we've taken to funding at EEC. And so really trying to keep up with not only the progress on these, but as we were discussing last time, some of the modifications and enhancements that we'll be looking at as we move from a 6-month grant structure to a 12-month grant structure. So quickly going to touch on some of that, give you some timeline updates, and to know that what we are looking at across our FY22 appropriations is how and where other funding would be distributed along with that. And so that we do anticipate having much more robust information on both what the second 6 months would look like, as well as other funding distribution given the money that was appropriated to EEC in the FY22 budget, now that we have a spending plan and are able to move that through our process in the December meeting. We're working with advocates and stakeholders now to better understand what some priorities would be so that we can meet the needs of the field as we move forward. But I also, as we have also prepared for this special session and conversations around a competency-based approach to workforce training, is really also understanding where some of the infrastructure and structures that we have been building for the workforce are headed, and where we are looking to build that infrastructure in a way that can really more sustainably fuel and support growth and sustainability in the workforce overall. So moving on to the next slide, we will go ahead and get started with the content. So you have an update on just our key metrics here of who is using the grants, who has pulling down the grants, and what our disbursement on a monthly basis looks like. I will keep in mind that this is a monthly disbursement. So even though we are showing only, that we have not fully allocated or fully released all of the dollars, it is committed to programs who have applied, and that's what that monthly amount looks at, is how many programs we've committed a monthly amount to, assuming that they keep about constant in their operations. We have accounted for some increase in educator growth because, as you all know, that we wanted to make, as we look and see about educator enhancements, we do hope that the workforce numbers do increase, and that is a metric in our formula. And so we've accounted for some of that in that monthly projection. But if we move on to the next slide, I wanted to highlight what we're planning and thinking through as we look at the next phase of the ARPA, of the operational grants. So as we mentioned last time at the last meeting, we are committed to moving the grants, extending the grants through June of 2022, so through the end of this fiscal year. As a reminder, we get appropriated a budget on a fiscal year basis, so this is the extent of what we can commit to the field at this point based on the appropriation we have. And so really, I know there's some questions around what FY23 would look like, and just from the EEC perspective, we are working within our FY22 appropriation to try to most strategically deploy the dollars that would help sustain infrastructure and help solve some of the most challenging parts of the infrastructure as we know existed pre-COVID, and we continue to focus on now. So extending those through the second half of the fiscal year will also allow us to use other appropriations beyond what the stabilization dollars that we received from the federal government. And allows us to expand. There was some restrictions on who could get funded in those stabilization And so expanding to 12 months will also allow us to open up to sites that were licensed or approved after March 11th and who meet our eligibility criteria of operating and supporting families. But we have, as you guys saw last time, have a number of programs that have opened up, and we continue to want to incentivize new providers to enter the field to help serve families that weren't served before, and serve new communities that hadn't been served before, but also be able to really think about some of the innovative business models that we know families are going to require as we move forward. So this expansion will also be coupled with that expansion of new programs, and we will be looking at developing, as we mentioned last time, specifically a bonus payment structure targeting the last quarter of the fiscal year that would help compensate those who make more operational investments in compensation and benefits. We know a number of providers right now have taken the financial risk of being able to increase salaries and compensation, or are looking to try to do that. We know that nonprofits have boards to grapple with as they think about trying to make these financial decisions. We know that businesses have a number of revenue uncertainties with families and trying to understand how we can provide a carrot for programs to take on that operational expense that we know will bring the workforce back in at a time where we may not have the upfront revenue for them through family enrollment to be able to really take on an expense of this sort. So really trying to be able to incentivize boards and business owners who are really thinking about their operational budget and leveraging our funding as a way to help support that kind of long-term investment that would be made. We know this is a long-standing issue in the field, and that people are really have found many creative solutions. So what I can tell you is that we're trying to provide as much flexibility and creativity to count towards that, and not so prescriptive that it would have to look like one specific model, but really understanding that that the compensation that people have been providing could keep people in the field over time. I will tell you, we don't have great data on this on a daily basis. We are doing a survey with our programs right now to understand a little bit more depth, but we did opt for the trade-off of collecting regular, deep monthly data from our programs to alleviate the burden on them, and instead just did a couple points in time where we'd be able to look at trends around, is the childcare we're subsidizing through these grants being utilized? Who is utilizing it in what communities? As well as really focusing on where are these investments going? So we are in the process of collecting that data. It is required to fill it out. There are ways that people can put zeros in there if they're not comfortable putting some of this information to provide some flexibility. But this is the data that we use to report to you, to report to the legislature, to report the administration. We have very little lens of what's happening in our programs on a day-to-day basis in terms of utilization and budgeting, and this gives us a little snapshot to be able to talk to everyone around what the impact we're having is. That said, anecdotally, I will tell you, I don't think I have been on the phone with one provider or been in a room with one provider over the last few weeks, particularly as we announced moving from 6-month to 12-month grants at the last board meeting, where directors or staff hadn't had the most overwhelmingly heart-filled stories about the impact that $1,000 stipend is having of being able to have a director give up another job so that they can focus and be present at work without having to worry about finances, from providers who've been able to do paid PD days for the first time and support their staff in being able to really reflect their expertise and collaborate and do all the things we know teachers really need to be able to hone their craft, but not on their own time and their own dime. And so being able to really try to figure out these strategies, while of course we will not see immediate impact for showing up in data on third grade reading scores or any of that. But I think that what I can tell you just from my experience, and a lot of you have this too, is that alleviating that stress, that burden for teachers, there is no way that is not having an impact for children on the day-to-day experience that children are having. And so really, I think we look forward to really collecting the data and being able to give a much more aggregated sense of what's happening. But on the anecdotal sense, of all of you who talk to programs too, that the impact of this structure is really creating stability and creating a sense of sustainability in our childcare programs. So as we look to see over the second 6 months of this grant, we are actively working with third sector capital partners right now to understand where and how we could use the data from the first few months of the grant to understand where we can make enhancements, increase base levels, think about educator bonus type questions a little bit more creatively, and in particular, really understand what an enhancement for that last quarter might look like around compensation and benefits. So right now, we are actively starting to think through that. We have been modeling and are looking forward to bringing that, as we always do, back to the field to get some feedback. And people should pay attention to this strategic action portal where we will have some webinars in the next probably 4 to 6 weeks on some of the constructs that are starting to emerge given the data we have. So we look forward to getting people's feedback and coming back to all of you with more of a model and conversation around what the field is asking for. We do anticipate that we would have additional access to additional programs sooner than we will have the full enhancement released. We're working actively now to try to figure out how we could include programs that were licensed or approved after March 11th and really incorporate them more quickly into the grant, which is quite frankly a slightly easier lift than trying to figure out some embedded enhancements in the formula itself. We do anticipate that we would be prepared by January to address the enhancements and lay those out for people to give adequate time to make any adjustments in budgets before that would be underway. And then, of course, as I mentioned, leveraging our appropriation in FY22 to consider this more deeply and understanding the full suite of the federal and state requirements put from budgets and regulations, and making sure we're meeting all the requirements of the budget language as we consider continuing to provide these funds to the field. So I think that is the update we wanted to provide on the ARPA grants. Happy to take any questions before we moved into the educator framework. Yeah, Sheila.
I had a question about the incentives. Can you describe some of the incentives you're using to encourage providers to provide for salaries and benefits, Commissioner?
We don't have those right now. That's what we're considering with third sector. Right now, what we're seeing, Sheila, just at a high level, is about 93% of our programs are actually trying to address some sort or spending some of this money on compensation. And it's a variety of ways. Some of them are monthly stipends. Some of them are, again, paid PD days. But what we're hearing, as we mentioned last time, is that more investments in salary and benefits would really help recruit a workforce. And so trying to understand how we can try to incentivize that without requiring it, so that people are willing to take on some of the long-term risk, even though we may not be able to have the known impact of the FY23 budget yet.
Okay. Well, we'll look forward to hearing about those. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yep.
Anybody else with comments or questions? Feel free to jump in. Great.
Excellent.
Thank you for the update.
Yes. I want to say one other thing on Sheila, on the point of things we're considering. It won't necessarily, and we'll say this, we won't require people to have made additional impacts after we announce what the incentive looks like. We will for sure count investments. I know many programs made salary increases in July last year, for
Right.
example, at the beginning of their fiscal year. We would reflect that as part of this. We are not looking to try to ask for new incentives so much as trying to give reflect those who took on additional operating costs in this fiscal year through an additional operating funding that would help compensate for that. So I just wanted to make it clear it won't necessarily, we really are trying to consider those who have already been leaders in trying to solve for some of this. Okay, so moving to the next slide. I will hit on this quickly, and I really want to make sure that we have time to look through some of the constructs we're building, but also really thoughtfully just mostly wanted to set up where we are. So as we talk about the constructs that in the special session today, there's also a calibration of what we are in a place to try to achieve that might really help foster a rich discussion. So you all have seen this slide many times, so I will not belabor this, but I do want to take this opportunity to say for those of you all or others who are interested in a far deeper conversation of this, this is a capture of some of the conversation and dialogue we had at the Joint Advisory and Workforce Council last week, in which we were able to talk with a variety of stakeholders who were at that meeting and on those councils around some of the operational considerations for this. So I will highlight the highlights of it. For those listening at home who are interested in actually having a deep conversation, there's a little bit more of a precursor at that meeting, which was recorded as well and will be up online. But also we will continue to do engagements on this work and surveys are going out to try to capture some of feedback on where we are right now. So I just want to highlight on this slide, really as we've been thinking about this from the strategic plan, is looking at the educator and the program pillars as interrelated, but also distinct. And so as we've gone into some of the constructs of how we are going to support the workforce, one of the innovations in how we structured the strategic plan is to really understand that compensation was a sector business model question and not only an educator question. It's not only, people don't choose their qualifications and then ask for compensation. It's more of a structural business model question. And so really then to the point of the ARPA grants provided us a launching point for being able to understand how we could invest and try to really fix this really broken component of the existing business model that relied on parent fees to be able to address operational costs like compensation. And so we have this structure that we are, as I just mentioned, looking through understanding enhancements and using that to address more of the program operational revenue that drives compensation levels. But also know that that's great, but the biggest challenge our programs have right now is finding qualified educators to be able to fit into that, even with increasing salaries and all of the ways that they are creatively trying to recruit into the field with the money that we're providing. And so one of the things as we delve in today, we'll contextualize again and remind on some of the things overall that we're doing for the workforce and hone in on some of the infrastructure that is quickly being developed and launched, what the roadmap for that looks like, of being able to build a database of educators that really is a resource rather than a burden for educators, as well as trying to then use that to leverage a construct of what building competency looks like over time for someone who is engaging and growing in the field. So I just wanted to highlight as we did this, the innovation we came with at the strategic plan of looking at both of those. I think that traditionally in this field, we've looked at the compensation challenge as an educator issue. And I think this construct really helped us understand that it was, it's a business model question as well. So moving on to the next slide, I'll hone in a little bit. Again, I won't spend as much time on the strategic plan parts of that because I know you all are familiar with this, but just highlight the fact that, our goal is to sustain a pipeline of educators, but also really understand what sustaining that looks like means articulating and supporting a growth and competency over time. So it really becomes a profession that we're building around as opposed to a job that people are going to every day. And so as we've been able to do that, you've seen this slide before when we came to you in September, and I wanted to give some updates on where we are, or you've seen this image on the right-hand side, I guess, when we talked in September. I wanted to give an update of where we are. And also be able to let people know, as we've been looking at the policies as well. We continue to work on the policies that we're promising. We've been providing a lot of flexibility and training internally and work to make sure that we can continue to provide flexibility for our workforce and empower our program directors to skip things that they had traditionally had to gauge with EEC on, circumvent some of the backlogs and really hone and empower our program directors to be able to recruit qualified staff and verify their qualifications on site. So this is a big deal for us in terms of our operational capacity. I've spent some time with the people in the field to try to explain some of this. This broadening flexibility will also couple with we'll be stopping our teacher qualification process where people send documents into us to be secondly verified after they're verified at the site. We'll then be really trying to figure out, and we'll get to this in a second, the infrastructure that will replace that over time. But in the meantime, trying to empower our program directors and those on site to be able to look at the information without needing a secondary check by EEC. We're also working across the training modules of trying to better market the field of childcare, be able to explain to job seekers through our career coaches and mass hire boards where how we are incentivizing wage increases in childcare, that wages are increasing, that there are many benefits to this, that there aren't many barriers to entry to the field, and that we are providing support. So that's another component of what we're looking at. Again, you said that focusing on access to preparation programs is key. You have a little bit of an update there, and we'll continue to release information on that. And really, again, our operational grants and focusing on the employers as a component of that educator recruitment piece of we have been launching business cohorts that have been working with employers to make sure that they're able to better conceptualize budget and revenue, as well as give operational dollars in a way that will drive some of those fixes given some of the fluctuations in enrollment that we continue to see. I will just anecdotally say that the business cohorts, the initial few pilots that we tried were so successful that we're being asked for, it was sort of a 101 model for 201 and 301, and really an increasing demand for being able to look at the business supports. And so we're really working to build those out as quickly as possible. But that one I wanted to focus on today is what we're really doing aggressively to try to build those clear and compelling career pathways of looking at how we will launch a professional registry that will evolve over the next year to incorporate all of the components that EEC is responsible for our educators, which I'll explain in a second, as well as then planning for what will be built on that, which is a credential system that will help validate the building competency over time for a workforce that works in childcare, and obviously the peripheral value of that in other juxtaposed sectors of the childcare. I'm going to dig into those. So unless there's any questions on anything else besides that last couple bullet points on there, which will go in farther depth, I will plan to move on. Okay. Not seeing any. We can move on to the next slide. So our registry, I have to just give the biggest shout out to the team, because when we said about 6 months ago, we've got to accelerate building the registry, I don't think anyone really envisioned that we would be at a position to actually have a technology framework up and running by this point. But we do have the infrastructure built and the initial code built, where we will, you have the screenshots on the right-hand side. We're not quite ready to roll it out yet, because obviously there's a lot of operational support that needs to be built to make sure we understand where this is going and that people can engage effectively. But it is built in the Salesforce, the Salesforce system, which means it aligns completely with our licensing database, which means two things. One, if you are already in our lead system for any reason, either you're a family childcare home licensee or a family childcare assistant or a group and school age program director, whatever, you use the same login. You don't have to worry about trying to remember two different things. The other thing it will do is it means it is naturally and by design, not only tracking the educator registry, which I'll talk about in a second, but also the employment history, because that educator database will be hooked up to the roster management that our programs already fill out. And so the programs fill out who's in which role. Now they will, instead of having to put information in, we'll be able to link a educator registry, and we'll be able to track that over time and be able to understand real-time turnover rates, real-time compensation increases, and really understand at a much more macro level what is happening with our workforce to inform our policy decisions. Ultimately, though, this registry record will encompass all of the components of our EEC educator supports that we currently are responsible for. So right now, we track credentials, whether you have a degree or certification, ongoing professional development. Sometimes it's tracked in the licensing, sometimes at the site level, sometimes in our PQ registry. And so really what this will do is create a central hub that everyone will have the same lens into, to be able to make sure we're tracking degrees and professional development in a single place. It will also have, right now, you have the Strong Start learning management system, the LMS, that every educator is required to meet our federal standards of the 10 EEC essentials trainings. These will, right now, they print those out and they bring them to their employer to demonstrate that they've achieved that. This will now be able to be tracked over time in our record, so that doing that once is tracked, we'll be able to show, and when you go to a new employer, if you forgot your, if you lost your certificate, you won't have to try to log in and do it again. You'll be able to see it on your on your record, which from employers coming to me and talking about the number of times they have to pay employee an extra hour or two to be able to compensate for a training that they can't find or that they wasn't tracked, or that will help eliminate that, so that we're really making sure we're building competency and not making people duplicate the same kind of trainings again. It will also have our background record check suitability status. So it won't, we do have to have a secure database that talks to the FBI, but for a program right now that has to log into two different systems to understand whether the person has a qualifying background to work, and then to understand their credentials and all of that, it'll be housed in a single record. This will really give EEC an opportunity to help build, again, comprehensive support for educators, as opposed to some of the varying engagements they have now across the department, which can be confusing. You get different messaging, and obviously it's an administrative burden for both our programs and our educators who are trying to recruit and grow in the field. So if we move on to the next slide, I'm going to give you a little bit more of an understanding of what the roadmap looks like to incorporate all of these things, so you can see what the next year of rollout looks like. Obviously, phase one is trying to focus on just getting a record. The value of this up front, we'll be rolling this out in a very thoughtful way. But as I just mentioned, as we're looking at our operational grants and tracking the number of educators, we are hoping sooner rather than later that we can support our group and school age employees to get in there to minimize the burden on our group and school age licensees from having the programs from having to upload educator records when they have a new educator hired. It could be more automated and support for the second 6 months of the grant, a more automated record of how many educators are working, and thus in the driving formula changes with less administrative burden on our providers specifically. But that record will, at this point, just be that. It will be basically creating your digital filing cabinet. You won't really have the ability so much to put so much in immediately, but that's what we're building out over time. And so then we will look, the second phase, we'll look at specifically those early ed essentials that we require, the EEC essential trainings that I mentioned on our LMS. We'll look to incorporate that as well as all other trainings in our LMS. Some of the things we've built over the last year to respond to the field is an extensive support around pyramid model and mental health training for teachers. So being able to track that a teacher, an educator is actually building competency in social emotional responsiveness, and individualized instruction like the pyramid model offers will be a great benefit to our programs, we hope too. And again, being able to give credit to people who are in the field to stay in the field, even if they change employers or change location or have to move, or for a variety of reasons, people change jobs. And the next round, we have been working actively behind the scenes to adjust our background record check technology, and we built it in such a way that it will connect with the registry. So by the end of the fiscal year, we'll be in a place where the registry will actually be a universal access point to the background record check system as well, and really have that be a person-centric model that won't be as burdensome for employers. They'll be able to see the record through the registry as opposed to have to log into other places, as I said, and be able to track the status of that background record check for an employee throughout the review process that we are federally required to do. And then finally, where I will talk in a little bit more detail in a second, is that phase 4, which is building out the credentials. So we are actively on a parallel track, really conceptualizing what does a credentialing system for EEC in this field look like, and really thinking through what that is, how that integrates, and we use this as a mechanism to track that. So again, it's all in one comprehensive system. And that will be built out as phase 4 as we come to some universal alignment, which hopefully today's conversation will really help inform of what does a competency-based credential really need to look like, and what is EEC's role in that. So I'm going to go on and talk quickly about the credential system. For a second, I want to highlight the 2 areas we're talking about, some of the challenges we're having as we launch in today's conversation, and give some of that update. If you have any other questions, I'm going to keep going so we have enough time to be able to break as well, but I am looking for hands, so feel free to raise your hand if there are any other questions.
Commissioner, just a comment, once it's fully implemented, like, it'd just be really interesting to see the data and information that you'll be able to get in a kind of real-time way to maybe address some trends versus kind of really looking back. And so a pretty exciting project that seems to be moving really quickly. So great job to you and your team.
To the team completely, because this has been yeoman's work to try to figure out how to make this both roll out quickly and also be really a building block and not having to take steps back. So thank you so much. And I think the data that we're going to get from this, even now we're trying to estimate some of the data from the grants around educator capacity. And it's difficult to get those really robust estimates that I feel are valid and reliable enough to put out publicly to everyone. And so this real-time data will be vital. I'm really excited about this. So moving on to the next slide, in terms of now, okay, so we have a great robust registry with all of the records, but how do we really think about this as a mechanism for growth around the field as a profession? So we went over this in September, won't spend too much time. I want to really highlight again as much as possible that this is still a working draft, and you will see right now, we, as I mentioned, talk deeply with the advisory council on some of this, but also we'll be putting out surveys and webinars and engagement opportunities to help weigh in on some of this. And we'll also say out loud that our team is going to meetings regularly to try to get into smaller conversations. So if you do know of a place that would be helpful in thought partnering around the development of some of this, please let us know, and we'll be going and having smaller group conversations, which sometimes offer a little bit more nuance into our construct as we go forward. But if we go to the next slide, I think the key part is this has two pathways. It has a degree pathway and it has a work experience pathway. What we know about the degree pathway, which is what our teacher licensure for DESE is or not around K-12 in general around the country generally has relied in, although there have been many efforts to try to build competency-based approaches, alternative pathways as well that I know I've been involved in. Actually, I know Massachusetts has been engaged with as well. But what we know for the early ed field as we look to build out some of this is that we really, it can't necessarily be the starting place for us, because we have a lot of people in the field who have been working in this field for a long time, have gained a lot of expertise and competency, and not always had the access to higher ed to be able to couple that with the degree. We know that doing the work well requires knowledge and competency and practice, right? We hear all the time that people coming out of a degree into the field lack some of those real life experiences to really apply, what you know about child development to the kid sitting in front of you dysregulating for some reason you don't know. And also, comparably, that many people have a lot of the competency, but don't always have the background and knowledge to back that up. So across both of these, we're really struggling and thoughtful about how do we reflect both a knowledge and a competency. The degree-based pathway obviously prioritize some of the knowledge credentials along the way and are able to push in some of the competency in as much as higher ed is really working to build that competency-based approach into some different models. But we still have, if we're trying to get everyone into a credential, we still have a huge gaps that we need to reflect in order to respect the amount of time and energy and competency and expertise that many of our field have built without having the degree. So if we go to the next slide, we have comparable challenges on the experience pathway as well, that we do have a number of people, as I said, in the field who've been here for decades or years and trying and have been dedicated to building this. And we all know those people that you can walk into a classroom or a family childcare and are magical with children, whether they have a degree or not, and know how to be responsive and are being able to provide emotionally responsive, trauma-informed practice, and maybe have gotten that through non-credit bearing coursework, maybe have gotten that through great mentorship that they have had in the field. And what we really want to make sure that we are reflecting is an area where we can validate that expertise that they have built, but not just based on the years of experience, based on the activities that they are demonstrating on a daily basis without creating additional burdens for them, but really making sure we're getting to the heart of the issue, which is the competency that they're building and not just the years they're putting in. And so this is a challenge, and one that we are really trying to understand across our two approaches, where and how we'd be able to hone in on a validation process, particularly for that work experience pathway, that would help us be able to capture things that people are doing in their everyday work, but really hone in on a validation process. that is meaningful. So I just wanted to go, I'll give you one more, if we go to the next slide. The final point I want to make is the challenge we have in validating some of this that I hope frames up some of the conversation that we want to have today as well. We have some choices to make in EEC. We can obviously provide a very robust, if you think like the Child Development Associate, that CDA process, a very robust portfolio that will capture a lot of really good work activities and competency. But the challenge is that is a huge burden to our field, and we don't want to push people out. Alternatively, we could, it is a great mechanism for catching competency and really validating that, but it is also a lot of operational oversight for EEC to build as well. On the alternative side, we could build a quick checklist for a director to be able to fill out and say, yep, my staff does this, but there are huge equity challenges in that of who has access to a director who can do that. And is that really capturing the competency, or is that, you know, a snapshot that may not be as meaningful in trying to assess? So one of the questions that we're really trying to dig into with the field, and very happy to have feedback, but hopefully this actually just frames up part of the conversation we have today, is how do we balance that building of competency and also from EEC's lens, a not too onerous process of capturing and validating that can really be meaningful in helping capturing, keeping, and growing people, growing our workforce, while we also work on the pathways, while we also work on the access to higher ed, and where we might be able to build a comparable access to higher ed, but really respect and validate those people who have built the competency through other mechanisms. So I am going to stop there and let you know that's sort of where we are and framing up some of this, and the point of the conversation of credential development that we are at now, and having these in-depth conversations with stakeholders, and really excited about the conversation we're having today, and to come back to you as we use that feedback to inform this with even more answers as we grapple with the questions.
Nikki.
Thanks. I just have a quick question regarding the sort of baseline that you're looking at for both pathways, which includes a high school diploma. Can you talk about the rationale for including that?
Yeah, it's a high school diploma or alternative. We do allow CTE, people who are engaged in high school CTE programs, to have a little bit of flexibility in some of those requirements now, and we'd be looking to keep that in. But the idea being that that is the current baseline to be a teacher in our program. So looking again to have that, maintain that current baseline with, but still allowing that CTE flexibility. The one area where that doesn't hold true, Nikki, in some of our after school programs, where we do allow program staff to have, to be in high school, and we would still allow that. And that, I think, is where some of the we will likely have staff that maybe has it has a registry record and is allowed to play certain roles, even they may not have an education requirement. The registry as a whole will be a tool to allow for some flexibility on that, because we'll be able to track that they have baseline without needing higher level credentials, and still allow them to play certain roles. Does that answer your question, Nikki?
Yeah. I was just thinking, in order to, I know that, we're looking to get more people into the field, and, if a high school diploma is really necessary to work in the field, then great, we should include it. But I guess my question is a high school diploma indicative of having some kind of skill in working in the field, or is it sort of something that we've always done, and so we continue to do it, but maybe it's not necessary any longer, and maybe we could get more people into the field by doing away with an unnecessary, credential there?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a question that might be worth exploring further. I think that I'd look to Secretary Pizer and some of the EOE team to think about also what is the overall gaps in getting through some of the high school GED or diploma process, and where we might be able to support those gaps as well. Because I would hesitate to try to bring the educational requirements down to a point where we aren't actually supporting educational pathways in addition to experience. So trying to think about that balance, but that's certainly an interesting question that we could continue to pursue and think through.
Great, thanks.
Yeah. Sheila, did you?
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's a little counterintuitive to me that we could be more flexible with a high school diploma for people working with school-age children, where I would think literacy and, some of those more developed skills might be required than with infants, where, if a caregiver spoke the same language as the child and culturally there was a symmetry there and demonstrated wonderful nurturing abilities. I think I'd agree with Nikki. Does a high school diploma really add to that? Just a thought.
Yeah, and to say it is specific to sorry, so you're saying that for our after school programs that we have more more flexibility, or
exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is an area we definitely have more flexibility, because we know that in many cases, and hopefully you'll hear a little bit more about this today, that that can be a huge entry point for our workforce as well, is those high school students who may be wanting to work in an after school program or be part of that, and how to build that and build it. So that's definitely something we're cognizant of.
I see. Yeah. Thank you.
No, I think these are exactly the right kinds of conversations, right? Because I think we have to get to a place where, I'll say this in a minute more briefly, but we want these multiple entry points. We want to capitalize on the experiences there. We also want really relevant training thresholds, requirements, et cetera, that really map to the quality of the interactions at the end of the day, right? So this is exactly the place to grapple. Can we take just a 2-minute break and get reoriented? We'll get organized, we'll welcome some guests, and why don't we just aim to come back together by 2:05. So we'll come back at 2:05, take a quick stretch, and then we're going to kind of launch into this roundtable discussion. Want to welcome some guests who are joining us. So we'll take a 5-minute break. We'll be back 2:05. Thanks, everybody. Great. Good afternoon and welcome back to the monthly meeting of the Board of Early Education and Care here in Massachusetts. And I want to bring us back together around this special session that we've designed for this afternoon on workforce innovations with a competency-based focus. And I want to first open this roundtable by thanking the speakers who have so generously lent their time and expertise this afternoon. I've had very engaging and enlightening conversations with each over the last few weeks, and I'm very much looking forward to this dialogue. As we as a board have discussed at various points in time and right through to today, we are at a critical juncture in our work and partnership with the agency as it relates to workforce development with an eye towards tremendous support for the field. And, as I've said so often and others, the Secretary, Commissioner, the last 18 months, even publicly in the narrative of the administration as well, the last 18 months have exposed the sector's critical and essential role in working families' lives, in the economy and society. And at the same time, it's probably never been more pressing to drive into innovative, high-impact strategies to both recruit and retain a talented, well-supported workforce. Today, we face an educator shortage, and our current educators are those who worked tirelessly to support children and families through the pandemic. This, of course, while we are also on the brink of what may be unprecedented federal investments. So we return to our system building goals reflected in the strategic plan, some of those shown this afternoon by the commissioner. In fact, and in support of the field, we've got this opportunity to drive the innovation and the systems building that has been aspirational for a long time. And of course, that is not, as we have discussed as a board and in a number of venues, that is not necessarily doubling down on more of the same. We want to take an innovative long-term lens to the shortage and do this work as part of the overall systems building work so that we address some long-standing challenges and goals with new strategies. As I said in my memo, we also want to do this work building from EEC's current work to support and retain educators, to increase access to higher ed, to strengthen the pipeline through that channel. There's also important work to do to continue in the domain of credentialing and competency-based systems of training and measurement. In the end, this will always be a multi-pronged comprehensive approach to workforce for all kinds of good reasons. So looking ahead together, as I noted in my memo last week, the last decade or so of social impact work has really underscored what I think are at least two critical pieces of information or elements for us to consider as we have a conversation like this. One, the importance of scalable kind of person-centered solutions to meet learners and workers where they are. And two, the role of public-private partnerships to expand capacity, accelerate progress. And we certainly spent some time on this concept in August. Building from that first lesson or sort of insight, the scalable person-centered solutions, I'm also very mindful. We saw the commissioner's slide from the strategic plan. In the early education domain, we've got to place equity at the core of our work. We need to mount learning opportunities and career growth strategies that are accessible, that recognize, but also leverage the linguistic, cultural, and racial ethnic diversity that is so inherent in our dedicated and resilient workforce right across the mixed delivery system of early education and care. So we want to make sure that our educators are well supported and compensated, that they are prepared, and they are also representative of the population they serve. So we want to think about this conversation in light of a number of threads that we've heard today and over the last many months, which is that we want to be sure that we design and articulate for all parties, the aspiring educator, the employer, what end up being what I have been thinking of as sort of this multiple entry points and pathways into and through what is an articulated profession, and that the professional training, learning, and growth is organized around skills and competencies that have been articulated, and that their progression is one that drives into expertise. So with that said, big picture, 2 questions sort of motivated the organization and design of this roundtable. One, as EEC continues to do its excellent work on the emerging credential in the context of workforce development and systems building, what is it that we can learn from other sectors and initiatives about how training, education, and intentional work experiences build, demonstrate, document competencies? And 2, where can we translate promising concepts into some scalable, systematized approaches? And I have been very dogged about trying to keep this lens on systems building and scale as we have these conversations, because as you get into this work around competencies, articulating, measuring, verifying, et cetera, it is often very quickly in conflict with scale. And so we need to hold those 2 together to get this right. So as you can see on the slide, the roundtable is going to follow this progression from some of the critical big picture issues through to a public-private case example, and then through to commentary from a national expert in workforce solutions. I'm going to suggest, as far as process, that speakers only take clarifying questions after their remarks and presentation, and that we as the audience simply track our own questions for what I hope then will be a robust discussion at the end. So with that, I'd suggest we launch in, and to continue to frame and the context and the issues and fuel our thinking and discussion, I'm going to turn it over to Bob LePage, the Assistant Secretary for Career Education in the Executive Office of Education, to speak about some of the current workforce efforts, but also especially the innovation landscape as it relates to pathways. In his role, Assistant Secretary LePage is primarily focused on post-secondary and higher ed career educational program strategies to meet the talent and workforce needs of employers in the Commonwealth. He supports EOE's Workforce Skills Cabinet initiatives in collaboration with labor and workforce development and housing and economic development. And he serves as a member of the Mass Hire State Workforce Board. I have particularly appreciated my conversations with Assistant Secretary LePage on the sort of both and nature of the systems building work as it relates to education and work experience pathways, and appreciate his joining us this afternoon. So I'm going to first turn it over to him. I'll sort of watch the clock a little bit and keep us on time so that we can get to that robust discussion at the end.
Thank you, Noni, for the opportunity, Madam Chair, I should say, for the opportunity to discuss a little bit of the current landscape in workforce and to talk about some of the promising practices and to share some observations of where we are and where we may be going, and share a couple of examples of practices. It's a particularly important time for the Commonwealth as we look to our recovery from the last 2 years and the challenges that early education and care are facing are very similar to other occupations that have been exacerbated because of the challenges of the last few years. If you go back 3 or 4 years ago, as we were having dialogues through the Workforce Skills Cabinet about the challenges that the Commonwealth was faced with, they were driven mostly by the fact that we had a growing economy and we had an aging population. And we had crossed that intersection of having high demand and high need for workforces and retirements of individuals. At the same time, those who were in the workforce often had a mismatch between the skills and the credentials required to our job postings and our job availability. And over the last 2 years, those gaps have in fact grown. We have more job postings than we had 2 years ago. And while we have more unemployed people, we know that many of those people who are unemployed now will need to have the opportunities to understand career pathways and career potentials relative to short-term and long-term employment growth so that they can be part of a sustainable family and a sustainable economy and a sustainable community. So as we think about each of the sectors that the Skills Cabinet has been focused on, in each scenario, we recognize the fact that we need to develop capacity to support individuals in training programs that will allow them to first get in on a continuous basis into training programs and then out to meet employer hiring needs. Your industry, like many other industries, hires all the time, not just based on pure academic calendars. And many industries, like your industries, with entry-level positions or frontline entry-level positions, also have significant turnover. So continuous replenishment and the ability to build training programs to be able to support employers on a continuous basis is essential. We also need to recognize that the landscape of the size of companies, the sophistication of companies is very different industry to industry. And you have a sector dominated by smaller employers, not necessarily large anchor employers. And because of that, they don't always hire as frequently. They don't know how to hire. They don't know where to hire from. And as they're thinking about the ability to hire and train, they may not have had past recent experience on how to hire and train. So they're looking for readily prepared individuals to come in who can impact their organization, their small organizations, and be at a productivity and a success level to give those students the care and those families the support they need to make sure that those kids start the day and end the day in success. With over 8,000 potential employers, part of the strategy has to be how do we both move people through training programs, but also how do we support them in hiring? And here in the Commonwealth, probably our biggest platform to support hiring is through the Executive Office of Labor and our Mass Hire Career Centers, and developing strategies to make sure that individuals who are being served by our career centers have the access to training programs, but also have the access to employers. We'll talk a little bit of why training programs have been a challenge historically. I'm going to be mindful of my minutes. But one of the important parts to think about in training programs is the Commonwealth, like most other states, has driven its labor force primarily through traditional institution of higher ed strategies. Those strategies are credit bearing certificates, associate's degrees, bachelor's degrees as the pathway. And shorter term training programs, industry recognized credentials, have been a gap across the country, but also, in particular here in Massachusetts, in part because they haven't historically been funded at the federal government level because they don't qualify always for federal financial aid. So being able to develop and deploy means that you have to invest, at least currently, state resources or available federal resources that are allocated to states to build those types of training programs, because you can't build them simply out using and leveraging federal financial aid as the sole model, particularly in models that have a single course or just a small collection of a sequence of course, because again, they don't align back necessarily to strategies for an individual who doesn't want to be fully enrolled in a college program at that particular time, or the start and stop dates don't work. And that's where developing new strategies for deployment is essential. And that's where thinking about competency-based models, hybrid models, apprenticeship models become solutions that can be deployed when we can form a network of providers. And we have a network where a consistency in communication on the quality of programming, consistency and communication to those individuals who enter our programs on what is the step on the pathway. And that really is the pathway from a training program to the value of that training program to continue their educational pathway and their employment trajectory. So clearly aligned and articulated pathways are key to getting to scale. The other part I will note that really is going to be essential as we start to think about this is how fast and how quick you can get to scale. Because while we are still trying to understand in all of our labor pools, what is the direct impact short-term and long-term as the economy is recovering, and we are in transition, I think we all recognize that in many sectors, inclusive of early education, healthcare, IT, manufacturing, we have long had a challenge of filling certain occupations. And that's where developing scalable solutions to move not hundreds of people, but thousands of people is a very different dialogue, where you need intentional strategy, clarity on strategy, deployment of strategy, strong local and regional partnering to make those strategies go from a concept to full implementation. And in particular now, I would recognize the fact that EEC, early education and care employers, are challenged with competing for talent with all other sectors. And the need to hire people is fiercely competitive. And for individuals, the pathways to employment has to be clear and reasonably achievable, which means we have to have strategies that allow people to start training programs and complete training programs in a relatively quick period of time. And then I just closed, and some of my other colleagues here are going to talk about some more specifics. What I will note is, as I've been having dialogues, there are many great things that are happening as examples of these types of programs in Commonwealth. What we have to do is learn about them and develop strategies to scale them, because they are small silos of excellence, but they need to be developed into a strategy or cylinders of excellence to drive the volume. We have to take small incremental steps, some of which we've already done. Recently, the Skills Cabinet has put out some workforce funding that would allow training providers in the EEC space, inclusive of other training providers, to be funded for training programs. And we have to continue to collaborate with our colleagues at our Mass Higher Career Centers at the state level and at the local level to build awareness of opportunities so that individuals can learn about how to get in the career, but also how to prosper in the career. And then I want to reflect just at the end a little bit about some of the chair's observation about equity. And I'm going to point out some data. I can share the link to you, but a couple of years ago, the National Governors Association and Gallup did a national survey, over 10,000 people, about what they were looking for to be able to develop their careers. And those individuals, particularly as you looked at diversity characteristics, all indicated their decisions about training and education were being driven about clear access to the valued programs, right? What am I going to get in it? What am I going to get out of it? Clarity on who are the employers in my community and what are the opportunities for me to get the return on the value of my investment of time and resources to complete the program. Their full recognition that there is a value and a risk to their time, that they need to have support at multiple time periods during the day in programs, and they need to have pre-training and post-training support to allow them to be successful. And then the last thing I wanted to just mention is, as we think about strategies and the dialogue that you had in your previous session, particularly thinking about high school credentialing, that there are many models with other industry sectors where we really are treating that as a both and. And whether it's at a registration level in healthcare occupations or other occupations, we have really worked through our adult basic ed partnerships with about 70 providers around the Commonwealth to think about more intentionally how we recruit from them, how we expose those ESOL and adult basic ed students to career programs, and recently how we've started to develop integrated programs that are teaching both the adult basic ed literacy skills simultaneously with the technical skills or the applied learning skills essential to be able to be registered. So you can build programs that'll allow somebody to get access to both parts of that equation of the academic success and the industry credentialing success. And it's really part of an intentional design that I think is at the heart of all this. So with that, and 1 minute over, I will turn it back to the chair.
Thank you so much, Assistant Secretary LePage. Really appreciate your joining us and these framing remarks that I think are just so aligned and consistent with a number of threads over the course of many months, right through up until our first two agenda items this afternoon. I'm not going to say anything more. I'm going to turn it over. It was a great segue to my turning this over to Professor Sam Intrater, who is chair of the Education and Child Study Program and a member of the Urban Studies Program at Smith College. He's the founding director of the Smith College Urban Educational Initiative and the co-founder of Project Coach, which is an innovative Smith-staffed out-of-school program that serves children and teenagers in Springfield, Massachusetts. And I think building from the secretary's comments, through Project Coach, Professor Intrater has a number of key learnings and especially observations around the role of high schools and approachable, accessible post-secondary pathways as they relate to training youth for child and youth-facing roles, particularly our youth who may be in underserved, underperforming educational settings, lower resource communities, but who, of course, have all kinds of talent and assets. And it is upon us to capture talent among our youth and young adults as we talk about workforce development. And bigger picture, sort of this question for Professor Intrater through our discussions, really interesting. How do we get young adults like those who are part of Project Coach into clearly defined, accessible profession that supports them on the job? So I'm going to turn it over now to Professor Intrater to keep this conversation moving, which is excellent. Thank you and welcome.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Commissioner, for having me. And I can see why you wanted me to follow Assistant Secretary LePage, because I'm here as a professor, but I'm also here as a practitioner and a professor. And my intent is to share a more granular case study of exactly the kind of innovation that Assistant Secretary LePage was talking about. And let me just sort of say that I think the gnarly problem is one of system build and scale, but I'm not going to speak to that. I'm going to speak to the case study part here. And I know from working in the field that this case study is also generalizable. And I'm going to share a story of an extraordinarily talented young person who yearned to be an educator in his own community, the under-resourced north end of Springfield, but who, in his own words, ended up getting stuck and having the wheels come off his dream. He is representative of many, many youth that I've worked with, and I will tell you the story. And as I do, it's important for me to ask you to think about this question. How can our profession recognize and support alternative forms of talent in the profession of education? And so let me start with what Project Coach is. We are an out-of-school program. We're a sport-based youth development program. And what we do is we prepare teens to coach, teach, and mentor elementary age children. And let me just sort of give you the founding story here, is that we became a program to solve one of the challenges of inequity that exist, which is that there are sport deserts and play deserts in our communities, real disparities between children who get to play on organized youth sport teams and those that don't. And so we came at this problem with this John McKnight idea that every community has untapped hidden treasures, assets that can be transformative. And our moment of realization came on, as many good ideas come on a soccer field with the director of Springfield Parks and Rec. And what he said is that he's got wonderful fields, those are assets. But what he doesn't have is he doesn't have the sport leagues that other suburban communities and other adjoining communities have. And we asked a simple question, why? And he said to us that he doesn't have and wasn't been able to mobilize the volunteer parent group that is needed to run the sport leagues and soccer leagues and basketball leagues. And that was our moment there. In the spirit of McKnight, we knew that an untapped treasure of every community are the power of teenagers. Teenagers yearn to do work with purpose. They yearn to make a difference. They yearn to feel responsible and have other people count on them. And the role of coach, sport coach, is a particularly right fit, sweet spot, if you might believe, for teenagers who want to be able to plan to do things. They want to be able to improvise. They want to be able to motivate. They want to be able to play and have fun and solve problems and adjudicate conflict. And so that was the beginning of our program. And so let me just take a pause from the details and begin with what I'd say is chapter 1 of this more granular case study. It begins with a 9th grader who is failing off the baseball team, and his guidance counselor sends him to participate and join Project Coach. His mom is a home healthcare worker. His dad is a para in the local schools, and he joins PC, and he begins to fill up his time, and he begins to join our program. And when you join our program, you first go through what we call the PC Academy. And I'm just going to quickly read off the kinds of workshops that our teenagers go through. They get and learn about child development. They learn how to be a part of an intergenerational team. They learn to be flexible communicators because they've got to communicate with their co-coaches, and they've got to communicate with parents and with teachers at the public schools. And they develop content knowledge around play and physical activity and how these relate to child development. They get support around thinking about the principles of learning sciences and the idea that growth mindset is a frame to approach the activity of coaching, but also every activity in their lives. They learn to collect certificates, whether it's CPR and first aid or soccer coaching or basketball coaching certificates. And they learn that coaching is also a form of critical impact and critical leadership in their communities. And so he goes through this, and he does both. We're doing workshops, and he's coaching 3 or 4 days a week. And we spin forward to chapter 2 of this story. He graduates from high school, and it's a moment where he is sort of lifting off with momentum and possibility and promise and a plan to be a PE teacher. And he enrolls in the community college. He takes out a predatory car loan, and very quickly, as he says it, the wheels came off my plan with that loan. And so let me sort of say chapter 3 is the next part of this case study of this young man. And he is sort of bouncing around from job to job. And he is told about a job in the public schools working as a behaviorist aide. And he takes that job and he absolutely thrives. It begins to dovetail with all of the training and all the success that he had in Project Coach. He becomes a go-to person in the public schools, someone the teachers call on anytime they have a challenge. And he's working with children and families and teachers, and he's feeling extraordinarily successful. And yet he's also at a complete dead end in terms of advancement and forward progress in his career. And he feels stuck again. And so what I say is that what is next is, and this is the questions that I want to return to ask this committee to be thinking about, because I think that they're here. Is there an alternative pathway for somebody like this young man who is truly top talent as an educator? He's extraordinary. I brought my own children down to be coached by him and his fellow coaches because they really bring such passion and verve and just sheer delight and joy to their work. Second is how can educational institutions, whether they're schools or out-of-school programs, leverage his expertise and talent? Because right now they're not. And third, I just sort of offer this: is there a pathway for growth and development that would eventually allow him to be working in an educational setting and move towards a degree, move towards the accreditations that he needs, so that what he feels is he's a full-fledged member and growing as a professional in this work of education? So again, my little case study of our outpost program in Springfield that has for years seen just how extraordinary young people can be when they're provided the structure and they're provided the support and the preparation for them to bring their natural gifts of leadership to the children of their community. So thank you very much for having me.
Professor Intrater, thank you. Hardly a little case study. That case study is playing out in the millions right across the country. And certainly I don't need to talk with all my colleagues about the connections between, the strategic plan, the commissioner's work and the work of her team Assistant Secretary LePage's comments and now this, and I think we're driving right into, thank you, the next presentation. So thank you for your remarks, but also your tremendous work with youth. So now we're going to turn to a case example presentation that centers on a public-private partnership between Pragya Systems and the Connecticut Capital Workforce Partnership. It was supported by XPRIZE to mount competency-based training, online self-paced learning with wraparound instructional and career coaching supports, including support during the initial months on the job, which was offered, in some cases is offered by partners, but ultimately is for entry-level certification into a number of roles. So medical assistant, we'll hear more about these roles from the group. Part of the strategy is, of course, you're hearing and you're listening for through lines. Part of the strategy with this case example too is the tech and the human kind of coming together, the human work and the tech as platform, the learner-centered, online, self-paced, the wraparound, but also a push to, in one of their examples, to convert traditional curricula to competency-based learning experiences, which I think is also of particular interest in light of our conversations. So there are 3 individuals here with us today to speak about the partnership, the project, some of the early learnings and data. It's very recent. Ramji Raghavan is the CEO of Pragya Systems. Ashish Kolaugi is the VP of Pragya Systems and the lead on the Connecticut project. And Alex Johnson is the president and CEO of Connecticut Capital Workforce Partners. And I'm thrilled to welcome all of them today to talk about this project, which has so many pieces that we have been talking about as well. So I'm going to turn it over now to Ramji to take us to kick it off.
Thanks so much to the board for giving me and our wonderful partner, Alex at Capital Workforce Partners, an opportunity to talk about some of the work that we are doing. I'm going to share the slide deck and use that as a vehicle for us to talk about some of the things. You guys can see, right? So the deck. So
Great.
just as
good, thank you.
Wonderful. Just as an introduction, and we'll talk a little bit more about the XPRIZE part. So Pragya, we are a Massachusetts company based in Cambridge, where I'm sitting right now. And Ashish is with me on the call, but I'm going to do most of the talking. And if there are questions and clarifications on the specific project, I think he'll jump in. And Alex, I think he's going to talk about the perspective of Capital Workforce Partners in this partnership. So before we dive into specifically the case study, I thought we could start with sort of the groundwork, right? So that drove us to create the kind of innovation in our approach, right? And the challenges that we see that drove this approach. So if we look at it from the perspective of a typical pipeline, right, where you have a learner who ultimately is trying to find learning pathways and educational pathways because they want a career and a path, right? And then you have training providers who most often are colleges, community colleges, universities, but sometimes, they're private certification providers as well. And ultimately they're employers, right? And if you look at sort of the landscape that is, starting from the learners, and as Secretary LePage pointed out earlier, right, everybody is looking for a clear connection between an ROI, if you will, between the learning choices they're making and the jobs at the end of the line, right? And more than ever, post-pandemic, if we can say we are post-pandemic, right? And this whole problem has been amplified a lot more, right? However, if you look at people coming out of high schools or even working learners, this awareness of what options are there from a career perspective, and in general, career guidance is just not there, right? And now, if they understand that there is a career path that they want to pursue, what kinds of college pathways are available is sometimes, all of these different credential options is sometimes confusing, but sometimes just inaccessible, right? And if you look at it from a college and a training provider perspective, and this, really impacts disadvantaged learners, or working learners, there is a supply-demand mismatch, if you will, right? Often colleges are used to having programs in fixed times, in fixed locations, and with a certain modality that's traditional, right? And it worked well for years and years. But if you look at disadvantaged learners, they're often working while they're trying to juggle all of these different choices, right? And ultimately, they just cannot make it work, right? And often that results in people not going to college, or even if they do, they have the persistence issue that we're all faced with in colleges. They just don't complete, right? And we all are familiar with the dropout rates, across the board. And now, if you look at it from an employer's perspective, they've got job needs that they're trying to fill, but the pipeline just isn't there, right? And you often have widespread shortages, and you have a disconnect between candidates who show up and the job skills that they have. And often what this happens is employers land up taking on this role of onboarding, and productivity of employees is often sort of put off for several months, right? And that there's a cost associated with it. And if you look at it specifically from a deep dive into the learner, right? And sort of if we think about it from a future of work perspective, right? People are going to go in and out of training throughout their life, right? And they're going to do that because either AI and tech have disrupted their existing job, and they've got to go get themselves reskilled and get reskilled in a really rapid way, right? Or, they are going to sort of patch together credentials as they go along, and they may start with something which is non-credit, a short certification program, but then they want to build on it and then get an associate's degree and then a bachelor's degree. And over the life or the career of this working learner, there's going to be a constant sort of progression of learning, right? And through this whole process, they'd like career guidance, and they'd like it to be personalized to their skills, personalized to their existing credits and credentials. They'd like the reskilling options to be rapid and convenient to them. And they'd like an ability to be able to stack all of this together, towards a career ladder, right? But most importantly, any educational choice they make, they want a clear connection. They want to understand the connection between their learning choices and the career options, right? And the learning should be aligned with job skills and competencies, right? And so that's sort of the problem statement. And I think none of us is going to disagree with that, right? And that sort of formed the basis for us starting our company and a lot of the work that we've done, right? And so, we said, look, there is this problem that we're trying to solve, which is, this mission of helping learners make connections between educational and learning pathways and careers. And how can we do it in a better way, leveraging a lot of the information that's already out there, and do it in a way that can really scale, right? And so at the core of what we do is an AI-powered, what we call a career compass, right? And which is a lifelong career compass that is sort of an assistant, if you will, for a learner. But there's a skilling element that's built into it, in collaboration with our training partners that they can go in and out of, right? And there are a few different elements that go into it. The first one is personalized guidance, right? Career guidance and just information in being able to connect, the job outlook with different, learning pathways and vice versa, right? And secondly, okay, once they pick a certain path, the learning pathways that will get them to the finish line, they'd like it to be, as their constraints will allow, right? In other words, a self-paced learning, competency-based self-paced learning that meets the working learners where they are, right? And, not about, and we'll give you some real anecdotal examples in some of the work that we've been doing. The third aspect of it is recognize that it's not all technology. There's wraparound support that's crucial, right? And it's even more crucial for people who don't have the family support that, the affluent learners enjoy, right? And the information gap, if you will. So you need to provide the wraparound support, but you can use technology to help scale that, right? And just like you use AI to provide personalized guidance to the learner, you can use AI and data science to showcase insights and analytics that will help the wraparound support and be able to do that at scale, right? But the last part of it, again, is, this is not sort of a one and done transaction. They may go into a skilling program, start working, but it's a stack that they're tracking, right? And then later they can leverage that, go back to college, and go get themselves the next step of the degree, right? Because that will provide them, access to the career ladder that we want everybody to have, right? And so these four elements form the core of a lot of the work that we do. And when I talk about sort of the case study, we'll keep coming back to this, right? But how did we sort of start this whole process? And we've been working with higher ed institutions for a while, but really taking some of these concepts and applying it to solving the problems of the workforce. The X Prize and the Future of Work Grand Challenge really provided us the catalyst. So the best way to sort of describe this is, we've all heard of X Prizes. These are moonshot ideas that people get behind to really spur innovation on difficult to solve problems. And when COVID happened, the problem that everybody was worried about is there are a lot of displaced workers. How can we, rapidly reskill all of these displaced workers, right? And so they, went out, looked globally, and we were fortunate to be one of 8 companies selected for this X Prize rapid reskilling initiative. And ultimately, the goal is to, find displaced workers, no more than a high school diploma, and skill them into high growth pathways, in a short period of time, right? And just like, we got picked as a tech innovator, they also picked a few innovative workforce development boards, and wonderful to have partnered and lucky to have partnered with Capital Workforce Partners in the Greater Hartford region. And I'm just going to hand over to Alex, the CEO, who's is kind enough to join us and give his perspective on this whole problem that we're trying to solve. Alex.
Good. Thank you, Ramji, and thank you all. It's really my pleasure to be here. This is a very engaging conversation, and obviously it's a conversation that's necessary given our desires to really be innovative, creative, and really scale opportunity. I'd like to just kind of briefly I don't want to kind of restate the problem, because I think Ramji did a good job of really stating the problem and the challenge that we're all facing in this workforce space, in terms of having large numbers of individuals who are desperately in need of skilling and upskilling. And at the same time, we have employers who are desperately looking and seeking qualified talent. What I would like to do this afternoon is just kind of give you the perspective from Capital Workforce Partners, just quickly identify who we are as an organization, why we saw this and seized this as an opportunity, and also, what solutions it provided to us. Again, I'm CEO of Capital Workforce Partners. We're the workforce board for the North Central region of Connecticut. We are one of 5 workforce boards in the state, but yet we are the largest workforce board in Connecticut. We encompass a third of the state's population. And we were fortunate to be one of 6 workforce boards selected nationally to be part of this grand challenge, Future of Work. In terms of how we do our work, I just want to quickly just acknowledge that as a workforce board, we work very closely with employers, and we have a number of employer-led sector partnerships, primarily in manufacturing, healthcare, IT, and construction. And as we're doing our work and really trying to see how we identify the necessary competencies and skills that individuals need to really connect them to the large number of opportunities that employers have available. So that's been our ongoing challenge as a workforce board, to really define the competencies and work with our traditional educational providers to ensure that they have programs that meet those competency standards. the challenge gave us an opportunity, and I'd say it gave us an opportunity in a couple of respects. First, as we all know, this was in the midst of the pandemic when we chose to apply to be part of this competition. It was in the September, October months of last year. And I just note the environment was such that, we were closed physically as an organization. Our governor ordered us closed in March of the year, the way we conducted our businesses in our America's Job centers, similar to the centers that you have in your mass hire career centers. So we rapidly used a variety of virtual platforms to continue to engage our job seeker customers, continue to provide supports to them. And at the same time, we had a tremendous infusion of individuals who were also becoming dislocated as a result of the pandemic, separated from food service, hospitality, retail. So these were customers coming to us with work readiness skills, but did not have the necessary career skills to be able to compete for the jobs that they needed. And then at the same time, our traditional training apparatus, primarily community colleges and other training providers also, because of the pandemic, were not able to provide training. So we were in a period of time where we had no training apparatus, or very limited training apparatus, but at the same time, we had a tremendous need in terms of job seekers needing our supports, and employers, particularly in the healthcare industry, were really kind of knocking on our doors in desperate need for talent. And we were fortunate that we were able to be selected as part of the Future of Work competition. And through that process, we were connected with Ramji and Prega. But what it did is it gave us a tremendous opportunity to upscale and really begin to provide training at a scalable way. The tools that they have, in terms of the virtual training programs are competency-based. They have a tremendous level of scaffolding to support the learner in a variety of ways. As a workforce board, we were responsible for doing the recruitment, doing the assessment, connecting them to the training platform, providing support services primarily for individuals who did not have, the technology support. We provided laptops and other kinds of support. We provided some other childcare supports, but we tried to give them the supports that they needed to enable them to connect and really use the tremendous opportunity that was provided to us through Prega to really upskill a large number of people in a short period of time. So our journey enabled us to really seize that moment, to enable us to provide training to individuals as medical assistants, clinical research individuals, and direct service professionals. We were able to turn that training around, working in close partnership with Ramji and his team. We were able to work with them to identify what training positions we wanted. They were able to identify the competencies. We validated it working with our employer partners. And we were really able to really respond to the opportunity that we had to really reinvent the workforce system, but do it using technology, using AI platforms, because I see that as a way of using these tools to really reinvent the larger workforce system that we're responsible for managing. So it was truly a tremendous experience for us. But again, I think the ultimate outcome of it is that we were able to provide solutions to the problem that we had in terms of identifying large numbers of individuals that needed to be trained quickly to enable them to meet employer needs. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Ramji to continue a discussion of the platform that provided us with tremendous value, and it really was a stimulant to us in terms of continuing to support the necessary innovation, creativity, and re-engineering we need to do as workforce professionals to respond to the challenges that confront us daily.
Thanks so much, Alex. So I'm going to, in fact, Alex teed up a few things, which I'll get to in the next slide. But I want to sort of, we stated the problem, right, with a certain visual, and I want to sort of map our approach with the same kind of visual. So if we think about learner and training and job, and so the first thing is from a learner perspective, provide them a tool where they can actually go explore career options and learning pathways and see what it actually means, right? But also personalize it from their perspective, right? An ability where they can come in, sort of upload their profile, and we can eke out the skills that they already have, and then point them to career pathways that meet their interest, goals, and existing skills, right? And then on the training front, it's all about creating online self-paced, competency-based training curricula. And our approach to this whole problem statement was that, look, we need to rapidly reskill displaced workers. And so the different people who approached it differently. I mean, there were some people who said, look, I have this really fancy VR-based training program for customer service agents, right? It's better than anything that a college has. And our approach was a little bit different, right? And we said, look, we've got this AI-based Career Compass tool. And really, if you want this to have a large impact, we want this to cover a broad segment of occupations, right? And the way you're going to cut the skilling time down is not by cutting learning down, but by actually fitting the learning to the skills and competencies that a learner does not have, right? And so if they've been a practicing, customer service agent, and they have certain skills, human skills, they can sort of breeze through certain parts of the training, right? And spend more time on the training that they actually need to spend time on, right? So philosophically, our approach was that we need this to be able to scale to different kinds of competencies and in different kinds of training pathways. And so in order to do that, our approach is we'll partner with source curricula, and it could be colleges, it could be others. Then I'll get to it in a second. And the third part of it is, really the wraparound support. We wanted it to go through the job search phase as well as within the job. And we are still actually in the process of doing it. But the way we've set it up is like somebody starts the job. In the first month of the job, sometimes they may want to come back and dip into some of the training, right? Hey, classroom management, right? If we were doing some teacher training, right? And I'd like to go back and refer to stuff that I learned, right? And currently our educational system and the way colleges are set up, and that's just not, easy to do, right? And so we give them full access to the entire training program, even as they are months into the job, right? And provide some level of support through that. So, I mean, this is sort of talking about the philosophy behind it. And, this is sort of the real life example of it, right? And so let me start with, what I said in terms of the career pathways that we pick. So when we started off and when, and Alex stated that, in his summary, right, we didn't come in and say, look, we've got this one training program for this particular career, right? Take it or leave it, right? And so instead we said, look, okay, where is the demand and where are the struggles that you're having, right? And so medical assistant, medical admin assistant was one pathway, which is very well defined, but it's often inconvenient for some of these learners with all of the constraints that they have to pursue that pathway into a certification, right? The second thing that we wanted to sort of establish a proof point is there are these emerging jobs, right, which are not yet in the dashboard of what we are looking at in terms of career opportunities and so on and so forth, but the employers know about it, right? And so a specialization of the medical admin assistant is our admin roles in all of these clinical trials that go on in life sciences, biotech, as well as hospitals, right? And now all of us hear a lot about it because of the COVID vaccines, but there are thousands of these trials that go on all the time, and there is a massive need for these admin roles, which does not require any degrees, right? And so we actually worked with industry experts to put together a curriculum, right, that we offered to learners, right, as clinical research assistant, right? And so that's one proof point we wanted to establish, where we could actually turn around and meet the needs of employers, right, for pathways that are not traditional pathways, right? And the third one is purely based on, demand, right? There is a demand for direct support. And in fact, we did it at the very end of the process, right? And so the number of learners who went through direct support were fewer, but we wanted to establish a proof point where, look, here is a demand for direct support professionals. Let's go find, the accredited curriculum for it, and we'll create a competency-based version for it, right? And so we, there are three pathways that we took learners through. The second part of it is the workers themselves, the learners themselves, because of the pathways we picked, the vast majority were women, highly diverse, as you can see, right? But the interesting thing is over 60% of them have real child and family responsibilities. And we saw that through the whole process, right? And this is where the impact of this competency-based approach really comes into play, right? And because there are some people who just scream through the curriculum, right? 1.5 months, they're done, ready for certification, or in some of these pathways don't require a professional certification, right? And there are others who had to take a week because they don't have daycare, right? Or they had to take care of a family member who is sick, right? And so in a normal college setting, right, where the train leaves the station model, if you will, right, and they drop out of college and often never come back, right? There are over 35 million people in our country who have some credit and no credential, right? And so that we didn't get to that number easily, right, over time. And so here we would tell them the training program is available, right? And we'll keep the wraparound support. You have to take a couple of weeks off. There's no problem. I mean, it's not too late, right? And so that was our philosophy through this approach. And I think that is really powerful, right, in terms of being accommodating to all of the different learners. The second thing that we did in this particular pilot is we didn't do any pre-filtering, right? And so which sometimes means that some people are not ready to go down a training pathway, but we let people in. We could have taken the approach of, say, elite universities do, right? And so you talk about great graduation rates, but then you pre-filter everybody. So the likelihood that they will graduate is very high, right? Anyway, and we all know, but we wanted it to be completely open access, right? And so we learn from it and we figure out how to improve our wraparound support to nudge people through, right? Philosophically, that was another part of our approach. But, and the way we approached, the learning itself is that number one, it's not just about hard skills, right? It's both human skills and hard skills, right? Human skills is what we often call as soft skills. And the curriculum itself, right? So we want the subject matter experts. So we go find subject matter experts. Sometimes an entire curriculum is already established, right? I'll give you some specific example that I'll walk through. Sometimes from certification providers, sometimes from colleges, right? And we would take that and we would work with them and make it into a competency-based program. It's self-paced that we talk about, and the wraparound support. And the wraparound support is instructional. We work with partners on that front. There's career coaching, motivational nudging. There are several of these tech supported tools which have been established that really can help, right, in moving these learners through to the finish line. And the last part I talked about, which is provide learning all the way through the process, right? Not that, okay, you've got your certificate and see you later, right? And it's your job to find employment, and then it's your job to figure out how to start working, right? That's not our approach. We said, look, we'll continue to give you access to training, right, even after you start working. And so that's sort of a summary. And here is sort of one specific example of it, the direct support professional program. And in some ways, it's there are similarities to the EEC work that the board is doing. And so the curriculum that we based it on is the accredited NADSP curriculum that University of Minnesota developed, right? And that is sort of the gold standard for DSP curriculum that, in fact, all colleges use, right? And so we went to the source and we said, look, this is the work we're doing, and they're more than happy to, to license the curriculum to us. And so then we took that and then we put the program around it, right? And the way we thought about it is we sort of back mapped from what the job requirements are. And so broadly, if you think about 3 classes of competencies, one of them is career relevant human skills, right, which are material to this particular career. And there are some common ones that you need in terms of professionalism for any kind of job pathway, but there are some unique aspects for certain kinds of pathways, right? And so we worked with some of the best human skill training providers and got some of that curriculum. And the second part of it is office productivity skills, right, which are necessary for day-to-day productivity, and then the core competencies of DSP. And the general approach is everything is sort of mapped to competencies and what we call micro competencies, right? And so ultimately, if you take job skills, right, and you can sort of loosely or sometimes very tightly map those job skills to a set of competencies that learners are going through, and each of these micro competencies you can front end that with some kind of formative assessment. And the formative assessment is not meant to be sort of, oh my God, this is a quiz, and it's not meant to be intimidating. We in fact call it a knowledge check, but it's more to help people speed through parts that they already know and spend more time on areas that they need more work on, right? And we could see that, right? And some people said they're very comfortable with office productivity tech. They've been working for years. They just sped through it, right, in a day. And likewise for some of the other ones, right? And so philosophically, and this is sort of a real life example of how this looked. And the learner experience for us was very important, and both the learner as well as sort of the advisor coach experience, right? And we use technology sort of to support that. But from a learner perspective, the idea is they ought to have a very clear view of the progress that they're making towards the end goal, right? The career that they're working towards, right? And the curriculum and the training program that they're going through is sort of divided into sets of competencies, right? We call these sets of competencies courses for now because people are familiar with it, but it's purely a set of block of competencies, if you will, right? And just like we said, career relevant human skills, core DSP competencies, DSP job support competencies, and so on and so forth. And in certain cases, we require people to start something first, but quite often people can do a little bit of this and go do something else. Really, they can pace it, right? The way they want to sort of manage their own training program, right? And as long as we provide support through the process, then it works, right? And so I think, this is all I had in terms of, overall presentation. The last part is, what is sort of the process, right? And, as I described earlier, when we got together, for this Future of Work Grand Challenge, we didn't have a bespoke training program, but we went and did this. And the overall process, we've gone through this a couple of times, is the first step is identifying, what the target sources of core courses and curriculum are, right? And there is already tons of work that have gone on, and these are out there, but, it's just a question of making it accessible and scale the access to as many learners as you can, right? And if we want to sort of drive workforce, then we need to sort of increase access of these training programs to as many people as we can, right? But the core subject matter expertise is there already, right? And it's, we just identify that and tap into it. The second step in the process is mapping that into blocks of competencies, right? Based on job requirements. In some cases, this work is for the most part done, right? And we may need to just do a little bit of work. In some cases, we may need to work with SMEs, with instructional designers, and to sort of do this whole process. But as we are doing that, design these formative assessments, right, for each of these small blocks that allows people to self-check their knowledge and go through the competencies. And these are all sort of well understood concepts. At this point of time, competency-based education has been around for a while, except that we've not taken it and applied it to workforce training scenarios as much as we should. But these are all well understood concepts that we sort of run through. And then once the training program has been put together, then it's about what the execution, as the learners are going through it, right? And so we set up the wraparound support, the people who are needed. And, as Alex was describing, right, when you think about career coaching, the subject matter specific coaching, we had, but certain basic career coaching, the AGCs and CWP have, right? And likewise, Mass Hire in our case here would have, right? And so it's about leveraging existing support systems that are already there, but providing sort of tech support to help them do their job well, right? And from a learner perspective, there is sort of a consistency in the experience that we can provide, right? And the last part of it is, the personalization of the training program and let the learners sort of start the training program and get through it. So that's all I had in terms of presentation. And if there are, as the chair was saying, if there are clarification questions, happy to, and otherwise, open to the discussion if there are more questions.
Really great. Thank you so much, Ramji, Alex, and to all who are behind this effort. I hope everybody is really experiencing this thread from the beginning with Assistant Secretary LePage right through to this example here. Any clarifying questions before we turn it over to our final panelist? All right, I'm going to now.
Wait, can I do have one. It's not clarifying, but I feel like there was a punchline in this whole thing, which is what were the outcomes?
Oh, it's underway.
Yeah. So
I was like waiting for.
So we're still going through that, right?
Okay.
And so we've got a number of learners who have completed, got their certifications, and so the timeline of the whole project is such that the job placement is going on right now, right? And so it's not, and in fact, we talked about it earlier. Hey, do you have a report of overall? It's in the works because it's not done yet, right? But yeah, I think that's where we are.
I would note though that, as we're looking at the progress and the system enables us to track progress and completion, our retention and the completion, numbers look very good. And as Ramji mentioned, right now we're in the placement process, but we've also learned through this experience that, as we allow learners to self-pace themselves, that also becomes challenges for some of us because, part of our experience with this, with the challenge was that we needed to do it all in 90 days. And that works for competitions. It really doesn't work for people. So some situations we learned that we have to support people, but allow them to do it, at their individual pace. And I think that's the value of this system as well, because it's so individualized. It lets people respond at their own pace.
Great, thank you. I am next going to turn things over to Kelly Aiken, who is expert in workforce development with a focus very much on facilitating collaborative multi-stakeholder partnerships that improve workforce conditions and specific jobs, and in turn improve community health and well-being. Most recently, Kelly was Chief Program Officer at the National Fund for Workforce Solutions and has just turned her professional attention back to on-the-ground workforce and social policy development across many sectors, state and community level. Kelly is based in Hadley, Massachusetts, and I'm thrilled to welcome her to this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It is truly an honor to be here, and I want to thank you for the invitation. I'm going to keep my remarks brief. I was really asked to give you a snapshot of kind of lessons learned at the national level. And first, let me say kudos to the commissioner and all those who have put together an amazing strategic plan to address the early ed childhood workforce and system, because what I found looking at the national at a national level, we worked in over 25 states, 30 communities, and virtually every sector, with probably close to 100 sector partnerships or industry partnerships, and really came to understand that there is an integrated framework for really both building out the workforce and keeping them and growing them in a way that results in the outcomes that you're all looking for, which is quality care for all, and the ability for the childcare system to really hum. And so I wanted to just tell you about the lessons that we learned, and how I think they are applicable here, because it's really, again, it's while this conversation has been very focused and very interesting around competency-based education and training, I think we all know that one siloed strategy is not going to impact and have the outcomes that you are all looking for. And so it is through the public-private partnerships that we've been talking about that are really the foundation for this work. And so it's really a four-part solution that we have come to understand and support, that supports innovation and the ability to scale with the idea of co-investment. So co-investment from the feds, from the state, from parents, from employers, that really has to come together so that that everybody understands what they contribute, where their voice can be leveraged and heard, and where all those resources come to bear. And so this collaborative model is really, and we're operating both at the state and the regional level, which I know you're thinking about. So really that becomes the foundation for making sure that workers are equipped for success. And you've heard lots about that, but really understanding what are the levers that need to be pulled to be able to create the system, the education and training system, with all the entry and exit points that you've already talked about and that you aspire to, with the caveat. And I think somebody said that, like the timing works for competitions, but not necessarily for individuals, knowing that everyone is showing up in a different space, a different time. And we really came to understand that taking a trauma-informed lens to this work is critical as we move forward, with equity really at the core of the solutions. So you've got equipping workers for success. You've got making sure activating employers and small businesses here such that they are actively improving quality and making their jobs better. So getting people in is as important as getting people to stay and grow, and really the focus on making those jobs better from a variety of different perspectives. What's a good job for me is not necessarily a good job for you, but knowing that there are a menu of options that really make jobs the best that they can be, and knowing that this is a workforce that is drawn into working with small children because that's where their passion is. And so that is really the parallels that we see also with the direct care workforce, is that tapping into that and making sure that people are given the opportunity to shine in that space. So making sure that employers are given the resources and the infrastructure that they need to be able to do that work on a constant basis. That is capacity building for small, medium, and large businesses. is the hand-holding that we came to understand is really required to be able to make those jobs better and to create the programs and policies that enable it to be sustained. And then couple that with systems change. And we started the conversation talking about systems change, and that with those two elements, employers and workers, if the systems aren't being changed at the same time to really support them, there's really no way that you're going to sustain this and create the space and achieve the vision that you all have set forth. And then to punctuate it by always coming back to those public-private partnerships, because players change. There is space where there are resources that, unbeknownst to others, have not been tapped into a formula that was really creative and brings new solutions to bear. So that is the kind of the framework that I have seen at the national level be most effective at the regional and state levels. And so I share that with you and leave you with a couple of lessons that could be applicable to the work that is going on here in the state. Building infrastructure, it costs money and you need to pay for it. And infrastructure is really at the employer level. And I can't reiterate that enough because my colleagues, my former colleagues with the workforce investment boards will know that those are resources that are far and few between, and they themselves need those resources to be able to support the industry partnerships, the sector strategies that are really required to do this work. And that the ability to support practitioners, both those who are in the workforce development system, those who are on the front lines, that creating that space you can't do this on top of everybody else's jobs. It really requires creating the space for learning, for innovation, for testing, for piloting, for failure. And I think our friends in technology would know that's critical for innovative solutions. And that, finally, the nuances of working with the varied sizes of employers that are in this space, it really does require the customized solutions that are critical, because what a small employer can do versus a big employer is just, it's fundamentally different, and they really need the different resources. So I will leave you with that. This has been a fascinating conversation, but wanted to just really put a stamp on the plans that you have in place and the strategies that are starting to evolve for what looks like a very strategic approach to addressing this workforce issue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kelly. In the spirit of one clarifying question, can you just take a moment and give a few concrete examples? If you use the word infrastructure, what are you talking about? Can you just unpack that for 1 minute before we open this up for discussion? I just want to be sure we're all operating on the same priors.
Yeah, that's a good point, especially since everybody's talking about infrastructure these days.
I know. Well, infrastructure is the word, right?
That's exactly right.
I'm looking at Alex Johnson, who's nodding, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, but what kind and what are you thinking about?
Yeah, so that is a good point. So, well, for the infrastructure that is truly most dear to my heart is the fact that partnerships really are part of infrastructure, right? That is where work gets done. That's where there is alignment around competencies. That's where there is support in the aggregate for growing a workforce. So, in industry partnerships is an unfunded mandate. Fortunately, that we hope that is going to be changing, but that is part of the infrastructure that I think is so important at the regional and state level. And I've worked with both Dave and Alex on industry partnerships, and to jump from grant to grant to be able to support the staffing and the supports that are required to bring employers together is critical to that infrastructure piece. Yeah. I would also say that infrastructure from the technology and the supports that are required for capacity building and really advancement of the system is also what I would consider as infrastructure, and that is. That is really the staffing and the technology to be able to support it going forward.
Yeah, so. Great. Thank you. All right. I could say so much, but I'm so thrilled that you're all here, and I want to turn it over to board colleagues for a Q&A, a discussion, reactions, comments, extensions, thoughts. I know some of these little nuggets were part of our conversations of the last 18 months, certainly at the retreat and right through until today. So I'm going to turn it over to folks, and I would suggest you can use raise hand, or we can just have folks jump in. Somebody want to lead us off?
Well, I guess I'd like to ask Kelly, when you talk about partnerships and how, will you give us some examples of various partners who worked to form this resource, this infrastructure we're talking about?
Absolutely. So I failed to mention that one of the partnerships that it was part of the National Fund Network is SkillWorks Boston. So That is a traditional funders collaborative that brings public and private funders together, the city of Boston, along with JP Morgan Chase and the Community Foundation. But across the country, where we see the kind of variety of investors who come together under the kind of the auspices of a workforce collaborative really represent philanthropy, state and federal systems, I'll just leave it at that, who bring resources to bear, employers, workers themselves. And, I think in a growing movement, really, a family-centric approach, when we think about if the focus is on the care economy, how do you bring those voices and the resources that they bring to bear, the investments that they are making to make strategic decisions. So that's typically the composition of a workforce collaborative, a public-private partnership.
And just one follow-up, then who provides the leadership for all of this? Because it just doesn't happen without some guidance, I would think.
Yes, good question. So we were somewhat agnostic in terms of where the leadership resides, but we see them at workforce investment boards, we see them at community foundations, United Ways, economic development corporations. I would say that that's kind of the variety that we see to serve really in a backbone capacity. And to provide that kind of collective impact model and facilitation support. And it really crosses over multiple sectors. And I think that this is where, if you talk about the direct care workforce and the early ed workforce, you actually could start to strategize at a very different level that I think is very new and exciting in this time.
And it's super clear from Kellogg and NSF and others that the backbone, there is no prescription on where it lives so much as that it's staffed and there's some data, there's a data function, right? And a communications function. Maura.
I have two questions, but I'll do one and then we'll see if anyone else wants to go. This panel was incredible. Thank you for piecing it all together. For everyone who's organizing this. So Alex, what have you learned about the role of technology as we think about how technology and AI-powered tools pair with humanity to make change happen? Like what surprised you? Because we gotta this is gonna require some behavior change and some suspending disbelief about the possibilities of technology. So just love to hear personally what's been eye-opening for you in this journey. And you're muted.
Right. That's it's like, here we go again. Alex, you're muted. But actually, that's an intriguing question, and I think I'll respond a couple of ways. As an organization, we're seeing where technology is really changing the nature of work and changing the nature of how work is performed and the landscape in the workplace. So we also feel a need to also mirror that change within our workforce system. So we are really looking to embrace technology as a support and training tool to really get individuals accustomed to it and get familiar with it and embrace it, because it's going to be part of their professional journey. Because, irrespective of what position you occupy, it's going to be driven by technology and the need to be technologically. So from that perspective, we're embracing it, and at the same time, we see it giving us opportunities to really scale the work we're doing. For example, the tool that Ramji mentioned, the AI tool, it actually assessed prior learning and prior competencies and prior skills. So it's able to do it in a fast pace, as opposed to we would have staff spending hours, drilling and providing assessments to individuals to try to get at the same level of information. So we see it as very complementary to the work we're doing, but it also kind of, redefines how best to really continue to build the workforce system.
Maura, go ahead with your second question.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Alex. That's great. I think another one is global. I mean, Ramji, you might answer it, but I think actually many panelists might have an answer. But how do we think about who pays in this continuum?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I can talk from our perspective, right? And so if you think about sort of the tech aspect from a learner perspective, we're really thinking about it from a lifelong learning compass perspective, right? And our view is the learner should never pay for it, right? From, and because it's a companion for them, right? And they go in and out, right? And the way we see it is the stakeholders here there are employers, right, who ultimately want people who are trained for the job, right? They are a stakeholder in this, right? And the second one is the training providers, right, who are providing some kind of training, right? And now the training providers paying for it may not be, maybe through federal and state assistance and VOA grants and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, I think the stakeholders are training providers and employers for us, right? And the learner, it's their companion. They keep the thing with them. And that's sort of philosophically how we sort of approach it, right?
Kelly, do you want to build from that with some other? I'm thinking about your experience in sort of framed care economy in the case of healthcare, CNAs, certified nursing assistants. We talked a little about community health workers. Do you want to respond to this too on kind of who pays, who's the stakeholder, who's the who's the paying stakeholder, who's the learner? Fascinating, can make strong case for, the employer to be that. Paying,
so it's interesting. I think that I would also kind of chunk out who pays for what aspect of this. So I think in this very kind of introductory, innovative stage, there's a lot of private philanthropy that is, the new profit is a perfect example. The X Prize, that is predominantly all private philanthropy, corporate philanthropy that is funding that kind of innovative work. So I think, and I have worked with large healthcare employers who particularly look at private philanthropy or external dollars to support innovative testing and piloting of new ideas. And then once they can see their ROI, they can see the outcomes that they expect, that then they bake that into their operational budget. Right. So I do think that, depending on the industry, depending on, kind of what segment of the industry, you could very well see employers paying for some aspects of this. I wouldn't put it past that in some states, this is where the state just absolutely jumps in. And especially if they're looking for standardization, I mean, CNA training is a perfect example. There's a standardized curriculum across the board with credentialing and testing. And so, it's distributed to training providers and more it becomes free to the learner. But employers can offer that, although I don't think that they are doing very much of that anymore. So there are some parallels, but I think it also evolves based on kind of the criticality of the occupation itself.
Yeah, and the stage of R&D, to your point,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
There's some proof of concept. Obviously, you're going to potentially start with philanthropy, but you might progress to the kind of ladder pathway that the state is mounting and in some ways incentivizing, right? Secretary LePage, one of our earliest conversations was actually about this notion of standardization and consistency. And when you want that, when that's one of your goals, that's going to influence who pays, right?
Yeah, I think definitely is. The more you want to standardize the process, you want to standardize the curriculum.
Yeah.
And you have an urgency to scale, then the investment gets more sizable and needs to be more intentional. Because you're dealing with timelines, you're dealing with impact, you're dealing with the return on the impact. So just a back of the envelope or the back of the scratch pad example is if I'm going to use skilled trades for an example, not suggesting other than the link to the programs may be similar. An example would be in our skilled trade investment, just make sure that we have the construction workers and advanced manufacturers and electricians and all of the skilled trades that we have significant skills gaps. we know that the cost of those programs are somewhere between $5,000 and $6,000 for approximately a 300-hour program. Well, in your case, the historical challenge that Kelly and others have mentioned is it tends to come out in small grants. And because it comes up in small grants, some communities win, some communities lose, some communities don't participate, and you can't drive scale. If you truly want to drive scale, then you have to make sustainable strategic investments. So in this case, if you want to do 1,000 people, then it's $1,000 times 6,000. It's a $6 million investment. And you have to look at that, as Kelly mentioned, from a return on investment perspective, right? What's the return on that investment to enable the success of your employers? Right? So our recent dialogue, for example, with healthcare is having our healthcare leaders through our healthcare collaborative understand if we need X amount of additional certified nursing assistants, this is what it's going to cost. But what's the cost of your organization of turnover, of shortages, of not meeting your compliance requirements, of not being able to grow your business? What's the difference between the two? And I think what we're trying to get is where does the seeds of those start of a systematic process then intersect with industry investment? So at what period of time does that burden or that investment become a shared investment? And that's some work that we've started to think about of how do we braid employers so that we have a sustainable pool of funds? Because ultimately there is a return on investment to them, but to start it off at scale, then it is going to need to be state and federal resources, because you need to be able to draw volume quickly.
Yeah. Yeah, I was also thinking too, I'm kind of looking at the commissioner on my screen. You can also think of it in EEC terms as this is very ground level systems building work that we're talking about. A decade out, the system may have advanced and progressed to a point where that braided model is completely feasible, tenable, in part because it's had this jump start towards a pipeline, a more dynamic workforce. In turn, right, we can drive up wages, have more vitality in the system, et cetera, right? So you can think about it evolving in several different ways, for sure.
Yeah, you can monetize some of those costs. When you talk about wanting to drive wages, I think of a healthcare provider. It's actually from the Western Mass area. A dialogue with them of, if you want to drive wages, there's two ways to do that, right? One of which is how do you reduce your operating costs in your human resource cycle, right? So if you're spending half the cost to recruit that person and you can lower your recruitment costs through more effective pipeline strategies, then you can use those dollars to invest in your employees, and that will lead to a retention, which eventually starts to shift the paradigm. So part of it is understanding the business model, but the initial investments in some period of time to drive the scale usually is beyond the scope of a single employer or a single philanthropic organization, or they want to couple it. I think Kelly's example of they want to cover certain costs and they want other people to cover other costs.
Well, and I think just adding to that is what I think Kelly mentioned before, is also understanding the variety of size of employers, which matters in this case. And I think when you look at the types of programs that are operating in this field that we would be training for, probably very difficult to either get an economy of scale in many of our small businesses. But I think, again, thinking about the innovation and learning and thoughts for scale is that, to your point, you could start with a segment of the sector that might be particularly prime for some coordination across training, either regionally or specific type of program or specific size or target audience, or many different ways you can slice the pie. And then having, really thinking about what you learn, and as we invest in the operational sustainability of the employers, really putting them in a position to be part of that infrastructure, thinking about where and how you couple that with training investments and what that can teach us about a scalable model that the state could think about learning and partnering and investment in long term. But I think this is, to your point, to all of the points made here, of really thinking about a launching point what we don't have in this field, right, is the organizing structure as much as you have in healthcare, or you have in K-12 education, or you have in other places. So how do we develop some of that in a way that, or how do we pilot some of that in a way that might be teach us lessons for scalability?
Yeah. No
I'm
question.
curious.
So Noni, Madam Chair, I have a question really quick. So this is both for Connecticut Workforce Board and the Massachusetts Career Service Center, the Assistant Secretary. Do you all have any data out there from folks that come to you that around who's interested in early childhood education?
I'll let Alex go and I'll talk about what data we do have. And I think there's a difference between past experience and interest. So I'll turn that over to Alex and kind of know the difference.
And I think you made a very important distinction, because we do have good data in terms of those individuals who, have past experience in the field. In terms of those who are interested but have not explored that interest yet, I think our data is very not complete. But we do have, sufficient data that I think is very accurate, that really speaks to the amount of individuals who have expressed an interest, been in the field, and have made changes. So in that data we can make available.
Yeah, so same here in Massachusetts, probably a very similar system, because I think we both work within the rules. But we all have sometimes slightly different data catch, additional data. As I noted, we can capture past work experience and be able to do things like sort if the people have identified past employers, past occupations they were in, or if they've included industry credentials, to identify those individuals who we can try to recruit back into the labor pool. That's something that MassHire has already done to try to do, targeted emailing, targeted outreach. We can also start to, as others noted, start to identify the characteristics of somebody who may be interested and has similar skills and similar experience. And I am not an expert on early education care, but perhaps it's somebody who has been a customer service oriented individual, right? Who has had that kind of experience. Or maybe it is somebody from healthcare who worked as a frontline healthcare worker and no longer wants to do that, but has the skills of engaging others, conflict resolution. You can start to map those skills and get a sense of who would other likely candidates come from. And then certainly you can reverse engineering by starting to study and survey those people who are working in the field. What did they do before? And then kind of backtrack to be able to find strategies to attract those individuals. The data isn't deep. We now do have the ability to do regional, and we do have the ability to do within communities when we have past data. Again, the forward-looking data is a little bit more difficult at this particular time. I would note, one strategy in other sectors in large scale-ups is starting to create those mechanisms for mini exploration activities, right? So you're trying to get somebody to say, can I do a half an hour module or a 15-minute module to learn about the careers, not to invest in a full credential, but now it kind of gives you a qualified potential candidate to now follow up. So it gets part of a recruitment strategy of how you can expose people, make those available, but then build a deeper strategy. That's one way to develop the data to be able to recruit more effectively. It's something we're working on with our colleagues like Dave Cruz and others in the manufacturing space. How do we create awareness modules that then would appeal to individuals to consider a continued pathway?
One of the things I wanted to just add on that front to pick up on what Secretary LePage said is, so there is a lot of data which is already there, labor market data, right? And skills required for occupations, but often it's sort of hidden in a place where, say, colleges or employers use to analyze within their framework, right? And I think part of, our mission is, look, tap into that data and make it available to learners, right? In a very simple way to accomplish, I think, what Secretary LePage was saying, which is help guide them, right? And look, you don't know what you don't know, right? But if you can make it simple for you to say, oh, you know what, I have these skills and 30% of my skills apply to this job, and you know what, I can earn this, then they're more likely to actually pursue it. And right now they're just blind, right? And all of this data, the wealth of data, the Department of Labor and Burning Glass, whom we partner with, and all of that is stuck, for the purpose of enterprises, right? And as opposed to the learners. And so that's the opportunity as well.
And speaking of the learners, I was wondering, Professor Intrater, I don't have to put you on the spot necessarily, and I know Maura has a question, but I think it'd be really beneficial to hear, as you are listening to this presentation about sort of meeting the learner where they're at, taking a competency-based frame. We've got online and self-paced. We're looking for wraparound supports. We're thinking about some of the nudging that's needed, because we've learned a lot from behavioral science about supporting non-traditional learners in particular. Like, I'd love your reactions to all of that in light of your project coach students who you're worried are going off that cliff or getting stuck. So we can go to Maura's question and back to you, or we can launch in.
Chairwoman, that was my question.
Okay. Oh,
I was like, what are you thinking about? Because project sounded amazing. And what about these high school students who are the most apt assets in our communities?
The ones I want to see next year in our hemisphere, right?
So let me just sort of say that it's always like an incredible sort of head spinning honor to be part of a systems conversation when you think of yourself as a practitioner, because it really kind of bends your version of reality. So that's been fascinating, and I just so loved hearing all of the reflections. But let me just sort of say this, that I almost feel like I'm speaking for what some of the young people that I've worked with for so many years would say. And they would say that a particularly pivotal moment of sort of growth and development often gets overlooked, partly because it's so filled up with other things. And I'm talking about that sort of really kind of rich developmental space of junior to senior year to what comes next. And, what I would say is that because there are so many sort of intercompeting sort of tentacles on their time and their attention, it's really hard time for, the kind of work that you're describing to sort of, catch hold of. What we do know is that in working with young adults, what they say over and over again are a few things. I wished I had more exposure. So this notion of sort of career awareness of just the whole sort of kind of constellation of opportunities that are out there. The second thing that we hear for them is that, boy, I wished I really would have learned to work my social network and to sort of to think explicitly about how do you build social capital, how do you connect not with just your near contacts, but your sort of far-flung contacts, the ones maybe who are not on a first name basis with you, and learn about what they do. And here's the third thing that I was thinking a lot about, which is why the young people that we work with in Project Coach feel more receptive to some of these conversations about career opportunity. And it's because we really work hard to sort of treat them as young professionals. Even though they might be 16 years old, we are trying to build with them sort of an identity of expertise. You are talented. You have these skills. You have these competencies. So when we bring in, nurses or physicians or other professionals from the far-flung community to talk with them about issues germane to their work as coaches and emerging educators, I think that they really have a stance on hearing things that maybe they wouldn't if it was happening in their high school classroom, where they're sort of treated as students and they're treated as sort of, the world is about to happen to you, so get ready for it. They really show up with a kind of a level of capacity. So to sort of, kind of move back and take a broader view of this is to sort of say, that how do we, kind of think about that incredibly and cultivate that junior, senior, first year out of high school year as a particularly, a particular time to moment their attention and their interest. So that was the kind of spin that was going on in my head as I was listening to the multiple perspectives coming through.
And Ramji, when you describe your kind of mission around the rapid reskill too, it's the same idea, right? How do we capture, how do we define spaces that can be unproductive or productive, and a good developmental fit or not a good developmental fit? No question. Yeah. Thank you. But I should also just add, Professor Intrater, that I think that thankfully, Kelly alluded to this, the collective impact work is telling us there is no more systems building without practitioners, thankfully. So don't think of the two as disconnected by any stretch. And thank you for joining us. Paul.
Thank you. This has been an amazing conversation. And, Commissioner, it makes me think about where we started this presentation, just as we think about even Maura's comment about the change management and just the use of technology that we've talked about on this call and how it could transform the work that we do, whether it's the registry, professional development, credentialing, pretty impressive. And so as we think through not only how it impacts the field, but how it impacts, I think, your team and the capacity and skill needed on that side of the ledger to help support what could be a pretty impressive investment. That's just a comment. My question is, as I'm sitting here listening, I think about how to kind of stitch a lot of this education work together, and just curious, just a comment, but if anyone from the administration wants to comment on it, I keep thinking about early college, and I keep thinking about the investment that we're making in the advocacy around this work related to higher education partnership with high schools throughout the Commonwealth, and the pathways that are being created in that space, and how there couldn't be an opportunity here for a little bit of a pilot or something as we again challenge ourselves to introduce this career ladder and opportunity to those high school students in those junior, senior years, in gateway cities and other communities throughout the Commonwealth. And so it just keeps coming into my head as I'm listening to a lot of this work that you've all been doing, and how do we stitch all this work together that Secretary, you're leading, and Secretary LePage, you're leading, Commissioner, again, that continuum of education. And so it kept popping in my brain. And so wanted to just make a comment about it.
Thanks for that, Paul. Let me just jump in and actually ask Bob to elaborate a little bit, perhaps. One of the things we haven't really talked about too much is vocational schools, which have early education occupational programs. I was actually just looking at some data as we were talking, just to sort of get some sense for what at least the postgraduate surveys tend to show about students who stay in the field, who concentrated in that particular occupation. And it looks like that either through employment or through post-secondary education, about 300 of the 355 respondents to the survey of the most recent graduating class stayed in the field. I would suspect, though, and Bob, you may have a better sense for this, that if you projected 2 to 3 years out, those numbers would be dramatically different and lower. So my hunch is, and again, I think this may require a little more data and a little more digging in, is that we're not making nearly as much of an effort to cultivate those students who are coming out of Chapter 74 vocational programs with an early education concentration, to get them excited about working in the field, to get them on a career pathway in the field, so that they stay, more than a year or two beyond their high school graduation date.
Yeah, I would echo the Secretary Piser's comments that yes, we have approximately 50 schools that are providing high school students early education and care specific training opportunities. Those training opportunities are very intensive, probably many more hours than would be in a comparable entry line position in your credentialing now. They tend to, in that occupation, as well as they tend to graduate, work for a while, and pursue additional secondary. What I don't know on data is, are they continuing in the education pathway, or are they leaving that pathway and going to other occupations? But I think we could all agree that 300 is probably a number that's too small. And so there are other strategies that the Commonwealth has been deploying to look at industry-specific credentials in some of our pathways. We have more global sector-based pathways that incorporate things like internships and specific industry credentials, and only a couple of courses that are strategies that perhaps may be more fitting for early education and care. because they're more scalable over a period of time. And they don't require the same facilities that are required of an in-house lab for our Chapter 74 programs that are our vocational programs. And they may, in fact, provide exposure and then continued pathways through articulation to our community colleges. And I think that really aligns to some of the things that Sam was talking about and his experience of exposing students early to coaching, whether it's coaching as a former high school coach who coached youth, or whether it's exposing students in those environments so that they have the aspiration of continuing their career. The earlier you do it, coupled with career coaching, the more likely they are to persist. So there can be some strategies to think at the high school level. How do you build summer strategies? How do you build youth work strategies would be a great example of building some way for students who are graduating or on track to graduate a year out to be prepared to go right into the workforce. Again, we know, particularly for those students, as was noted earlier, who come with diversity and economic considerations, when they go to the post-secondary opportunities, particularly at our community colleges, they're most likely to be employed. Wouldn't it be nice if we got them employed in their career path early so they could learn, earn, and continue on that trajectory? So that, again, I think becomes part of a dialogue about intentional design.
And that's where we start to think about work experience accumulating as some form of currency driving into higher ed, right? Bob and I had some of those conversations as well. And certainly Ramji, sort of this notion of stackable and how does it all work together as a system rather than making these high stakes choices and landing like Sam's students in this really, really unfortunate and totally unproductive scenario for everybody involved. Yeah. Any last comment or question? This was a great panel. Commissioner, you about to say something?
I think that, yeah, I just said this is a great panel, and I thank you all for your expertise and your engagement on it. And I think, as Chair Lasso was saying, I think just the idea that we can, that EEC could play a role in building that stackability and accumulating and validating the work experience coupled with the kind of competency-based training that would help make sure that there is a career progression for those entering. I think that has multiple pathways, that reflects the diversity of the workforce we're trying to recruit and the diversity of supports that means that they need is really, I think, the crux of the challenge ahead of EEC specifically. And this conversation is just such a robust insight into the multiple factors and multiple opportunities ahead of us to really build that. So thank you all.
Yeah, and I think the grand design challenge, to your point, is to not land with tiers, right? But instead to have a universal currency that is more about quantities than it is about tiers and sectioning out. So no question, this was just tremendously exciting, actually, meeting and session with all of you. I just want to say a great big thanks to Bob, to Sam, to Alex, to Ramji, to Kelly. Your time, your insights, really appreciate them, especially at this critical moment for early education and care. So thank you all for joining us. I know we have lots of ways, the commissioner and I and others have lots of thoughts about how we may continue the conversation, but for now, I'd like to adjourn the meeting and thank you all. Take care. We'll see you next month. To our board colleagues.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.